We are live in London. Hi, and welcome to Mind the Energy Gap. I'm SJ Beaumont, your host. I'm an M&A attorney specialising in energy and technology transactions. And I'm absolutely thrilled to be joined by Jonny, CEO, Team Blockchain, and all-round expert in all things crypto, digital assets. We have had the pleasure of working together a number of times, and you have gracefully had me on your show on Blockchain Radio, Cyber FM, and we've collaborated on a number of things. So I'm delighted to have you on my show today. Welcome.
Thank you, SJ. Good to be here, and just before Christmas.
Just before Christmas.
The city's deserted.
It is. It's a very easy journey today. No snow. Okay, so I would love to talk today about a topic we've touched on many times over the years, which is digital assets and the energy transition. So a lot of people, when you talk about digital assets and crypto, people think, oh, it's a speculative thing, and people don't really kind of see that kind of value. But how and why does digital infrastructure matter to the energy transition?
Okay. Well, first of all, thanks again for having me on your show. And I think really there's been a lot of conversation, a lot of discussion around the use of blockchain technology or DLTs, and therefore the use of cryptographic technology to tokenize, digitize, and I'm going to use the broad sense stuff. The first main adoption was actually credit cards. Mm-hmm. So the biggest tokenization in the world is Visa and MasterCard, because they effectively tokenize information so it's held more securely when they move things around. But it really came to light when we saw file sharing with Napster. Mm-hmm. And essentially, again, they were sharing information, sharing data. And then it was back sort of 2008 now when you saw Satoshi Nakamoto, him or her or it or shim or them or whatever he is or what they are, and created this thing called Bitcoin. And I would argue that really sort of cryptos came to fame because of FOMO. People were really fear of missing out. It was greed. Because had you bought just one Bitcoin, back in 2008, today it's worth around about $90,000. So had you spent 1,000 Bitcoin, to be fair, you'd probably be sitting on a beach rather than sitting in a studio in London today. And I think people got driven by seeing it go literally from a cent to at one stage earlier this year it was $125,000 per Bitcoin. And as with all these things, people jumped on the bandwagon. So over the years that I've known you, we've seen people trying to sell initial coin offerings, ICOs. We then saw people selling hand sanitizers because of COVID, face masks. And now everyone's wandering around saying, oh, I'm an AI expert.
Yeah, that's right.
So it's grabbed the attention, but it's led to a lot of innovation. But putting it into some sort of, I suppose, perspective, if you look at the size of the digital market, sort of crypto market, it's around about 3 trillion. Mm-hmm. If you compare that to the size of the bond market, the equity market, the real estate market, the derivatives market, they're 2.2 quadrillion. Wow. Now, if you're American, you think that's only 18 noughts. If you're a Brit, you think it's 24 noughts. Either way, it's a lot of noughts. And so therefore, the use of tokenization, digitalization in the energy field, in particular, is really, really interesting because most of the world economies have a serious problem when it comes to energy and energy infrastructure. And arguably, given the conflicts in Russia and Ukraine, Europe in particular has had a massive wake-up call and is really now looking how can it become more independent. There is hope. We've got nuclear fission potentially no more than 2032 away, in which case you get free energy, practically.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, how are you going to turn consumers into producers? And we're seeing legislation coming across Europe whereby you've now got to allow that to happen. So if you've got a little wind turbine or if you've got some solar panel and you're not using electricity and you've topped up your storage battery, you can now sell it to your next door neighbour.
Yeah.
And that's enabling people at a very small level to invest, and also larger scale investments where companies are desperately now trying to go green and meet their emission targets.
Yeah, and those kind of small micro transactions, those peer-to-peer, those are best dealt with via digital infrastructure like DLT or something like that.
It's a very decentralised form of production. We have a crazy situation, certainly in the UK and in Holland, where we've got literally hundreds of wind turbines built, functioning, and the Dutch and the British are paying not to produce energy because they had power offtake agreements. They said, well, we were guaranteed to pay X amount per turbine per week per month. Those obligations are being met. They're paying for them, but they can't. The pipes to bring the power into the country they're just too small. They need to build more infrastructure, bigger pipes. In Holland, they're looking at spending 200 billion euros, and it's going to go from the North Sea, bizarrely, straight to Germany. So the Dutch are paying for this infrastructure for the Germans. Now, obviously, the Germans are going to have to pay the Dutch for electricity, but that's a really good example of the Germans having to wean themselves off. They're reopening coal power stations.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be surprised if you saw nuclear power back in Germany, which would be a huge change. But all of that, you need to be able to track and monitor the power, because this idea of having one or two big power stations to look after, 10-20% of the country have really become outdated. And people saying we need lots of micro generation and not, because when you move electricity around, it's not free. You do lose some of the energy.
Of course.
So to produce it where you're going to use it makes a lot more sense.
That's a very good point. Definitely sort of around co-locating and things, I think definitely makes a lot more sense. But also, it's a good point you bring up about energy security and resiliency, especially post the Russia-Ukraine war. And Europe is kind of very much focusing on that kind of energy resiliency. But how do you think a decentralized system helps with that? Because a lot of people would, a lot of our listeners will be very sophisticated and understand kind of DLT technologies and that. But speak to people maybe who don't really understand how would a decentralized system, like surely the government is the safest way forward. How would a decentralized system like using DLT or blockchain technology, how would that assist with kind of this energy resiliency and security problem?
Well, look, all of us are increasingly living our lives more and more digitally. Our use of electricity is just going up and up. Governments are actively encouraging people to move away from petrol and diesel powered vehicles. They want electric cars. You're seeing the rise of AI, and I'm sure we'll come back to AI in a moment, but the rise of the use of that is exponential. And the main thing holding AI back won't be chips, won't be computing power, it won't even be programmers. It's going to be power, it's going to be energy. And therefore there's going to be a huge need for more energy. Yeah. Well, why have let's call it a gas or a coal-fired power station 100, 1,000 miles away, when actually you want your data centers somewhere whereby there's lots of free energy. So Texas is a really good example of this, whereby you're seeing they have lots of wind, they have lots of solar energy, and they're building data centers. Now, in the extreme, what they're now talking about is literally to have an array of solar-powered farms and data centers in space.
Yes, of course.
Because it's super cold.
Yeah.
So, because one of the problems, I think it's 90% of the energy for AI and indeed blockchain technology and most data centers gets converted into heat. So not only do you need a lot of energy to power the chips, you need a lot of energy then to cool the chips down.
Yes.
So it's almost double energy you require. But if you can locate your if you like, your data centers, your processing centers, locate them in a cooler place, and that's another reason why you've seen a lot of the data centers being located, particularly in America, next to lakes, because you can use the water to cool down your data centers. So the idea of having consumers here and power there, and because most power stations aren't the prettiest of things, that's changing, and we're beginning to see diversification, decentralization of energy generation. The problem is how do you distribute, because the sun doesn't always shine, the wind doesn't always blow. So some of the renewable energy, it is a challenge. Even in this country, I think nearly 40% in the UK of our energy comes from renewable energy on a day-to-day basis. We're lucky, we have about 40% of Europe's wind, but we don't have it all connected.
Yeah, it's an interesting point you bring up about the high load and also not only to power these data centers, but in terms of AI to train these LLMs, there's a lot of energy that is required, but it's also, as you say, a lot of water is needed to cool those systems to ensure that they run at their peak efficiency. Now, a lot of environmentalists are now saying that that power could have been used to decarbonize something else, and that water is actually taking away from it's a huge amount that's being used, which is bad in itself, but B, there are areas of the world that are certainly struggling for water. So how do you balance those things with sort of driving forward technology? And yes, okay, AI and new technologies is really good for the energy transition and for decarbonising the planet and assisting with renewable energy, versus it's actually using quite a lot of energy that is pretty scarce and water that is pretty scarce.
Well, the cynic would say the environmentalists, presumably they don't go on holiday in an aeroplane. They're happy to bang the drum and say, "Oh, you must do this, you must do that." The reality is that, you know, particularly across Europe, what we do in Europe is really a rounding error when it comes to the environmental impact of changing our power consumption. Unfortunately, you know, because you've still got in India, in China, they're still building hundreds of power stations emitting from coal. You know, you look at Australia, that we're both familiar with. They're massive exporters of coal to China. So us saying, "Oh, well, we want to have some sort of green energy in the UK," unfortunately, it's around here. On a more positive side, I mentioned AI earlier on, and one of the best things about AI, and here we are towards the end of 2025, and we're now seeing by the end of 26, we will probably see artificial intelligence being able to produce the fastest and some of the best computer code than any individual. We've already on the verge of seeing AI effectively being a super mathematician. And once we get agentic AI, we're going to move from using AI as a fancy sort of Google search.
Right.
And it's going to be used to solve real mathematical, engineering and medical challenges. So just round the corner from us is Google's London office, and they bought a company called DeepMind. Now, they paid $500 million for that a few years ago, and they said, "Well, why did they want that?" And the first thing they did was take 500 different data points from their processing departments, from their data centers. They weren't big into blockchains, they weren't mining anything. They certainly weren't using AI as we know it now. But they save 40% of their energy output by using what we now would term as AI, by monitoring those 500 different data inputs. So AI will enable us to become more efficient, but probably the biggest one, and I mentioned earlier on, if it can help us get faster to nuclear fission, then actually we can make redundant a lot of the power stations, and we'll end up with mini power generation plants right across various different economies. And that will have a huge impact in terms of the carbon footprint, in terms of energy production.
Yeah, I mean, that's the Jevons paradox, right? Is that if it becomes more efficient, then ultimately more resources are consumed. More resources. So, that's all got to balance out.
Very true.
Yeah, but I mean, look, data centers in space, like that's kind of quite a cool idea, right? I mean, there's always going to be people who are objecting to sort of various things. I'm sure people have an objection to data centers in space. There'll be, you know, space litter, and, you know, maybe we'll block out some sunshine. I don't know. Like, some people will always come up with some issues, as you say.
Of course.
But no, I think, you know, data centers in space obviously does make a lot more sense, because, you know, they're not going to be using up land here on Earth, which is very precious, and, you know, people get very upset about having it not in my backyard and things like that. So there's definitely a lot of innovations going on.
But Sarah, just going back to your point about water, I don't want to dismiss that, because I think water has all the potential to be an area of huge conflict in many countries, but particularly in the sort of, you know, the developing economies across Africa and Middle East. You know, they're very, very hot countries.
Yes.
They need water.
Yeah.
And that is a real challenge.
It is.
And currently using desalination is really, really energy intensive. If you look at somewhere like California in the Central Valley, you've actually seen the farms and the fields fall by, 10, 15 feet. So you've actually got the roads somewhere up here, and the fields have moved away because they've extracted so much water out of the land through aquifers and things like that. So it is something we shouldn't be complacent about.
Absolutely.
And it's something which is quite difficult just to manufacture water. So
I think there's quite a lot of misinformation, though, about this whole AI and water thing. It's a bit like when blockchain mining sort of originally worked on a proof of work concept rather than a proof of stake, and there were all these statistics coming out about how blockchain mining was using more energy than an entire country and that sort of thing. And I think it's very similar with AI, that yes, obviously there is this need to use water to cool the data centers, but as I understand it, some use recycled water, some use water that is not available, it's not potable, so it's not available to be drinking water. It was destined for other sort of uses like sewage treatment plants and things like that. And there obviously are other ways of dealing with the situation, like having a data center in a cooler place, or somewhere that's kind of got ready access to water, or somewhere that is not at risk from drought. So I think there is quite a lot of misinformation out there. And Sam Altman, obviously he hasn't been super public with how he's given his statistics, but he's been quite clear in saying that this information, saying that one query on ChatGPT is not as bad for water usage as everybody is making out in the media. Yeah.
And funny, you mentioned obviously ChatGPT. If we went back, if we went back, say 20 years ago, or certainly 25 years ago, we were staring at the abyss. Everyone was saying, "Oh my goodness, everything's going to stop," because when it goes from 1999 to 2000.
Yes.
The clocks won't work. The cars won't work. The power stations won't work. There's this big, there's the sort of the big millennial bug as they referred it to. But around that time, you literally had a handful of internet search engines, and then it really did become dominated by Google. Now, the reason I bring this point up is that if you look at the amount of money being spent, if you look at the technical progress and how the benchmarks are being smashed, not just by ChatGPT, but by Gemini, by Perplexity, by Grok. So we're seeing a number of independent companies literally battling it out. Who's going to be the fastest, the most used AI large language model engine? Now, the reason I mention this, I think this is really important because I don't believe we're going to see a one search engine or one AI bot that will dominate the landscape.
They have different uses.
Absolutely, but if one is being improper with the use of energy or water, they'll very, very quickly get caught out, because we're getting a situation of I don't want to say perfect knowledge, but majority of people have access to so much knowledge and so much information, and it'll be very difficult just to pull the wool over people's eyes. And I think that you're going to be empowered in a far greater. At the extreme, you literally will have a little chip implanted in you if you wish. Now, some people think that's absolutely horrendous, but how far are we away from a little chip called mobile phone? If you're quick enough, you can type anything you want on your phone and get whatever you need to get. Well, we're seeing that, and we're seeing it at the moment with glasses, with Meta, Luxottica, the who make a lot of the Ray-Ban sunglasses. They're the biggest manufacturers of glasses in the world, located up a mountain where unfortunately they don't seem to get much snow in the Alps as much as they used to, maybe global or maybe not. But my point is, you can put these glasses on and you can then say, oh, SJ, the last time we met, you had a flat white, I had a black coffee, we met at blah, 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 we talked about this, that, that, and you'll think, oh, Jonny, that is amazing, how do you remember all that sort of information? But we forget. And so therefore having a richer experience, or more importantly, if you're trying to solve a problem. So I mentioned Google just down the road here, and they've actually come up with an injection to reverse the impact of molecular, i.e. blindness in the eyes.
Wow.
So if we're seeing that, there's another firm working on irritable bowel syndrome. 15% of Americans suffer from this.
Yeah.
It's really, really quite painful. AI is helping, not to come up with a new drug, but to analyse your bio-gut, because everyone's totally different. Well, then maybe you're not using the toilet quite so much, and therefore you're not using much water. So there's all these spin-offs, which a lot of people, as you say, they don't like to look beyond just the headline.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's important to look at sort of all these different AI models as having kind of, everyone sort of groups AI as one thing, but and a lot of people just think of AI as the ChatGPT or whatever they have in their phone. But as you say, there's medical spin-offs. There's also models like Claude, for example, are very good for like writing code. They've sort of really been like the leader in that space. So I think we, especially in the energy industry, looking at repairs and maintenance offshore, looking at I hate to bring it up again, but carbon credits. When there's a lot of things in the energy industry that require a lot of verification and trust in that system. So I think digital assets, AI will add that in as people sort of get used to using it more and more. But yeah, we do definitely have to be careful about our energy consumption with all this new technology. And I think it's really important to be having these sort of conversations.
But just going back to your point there about blockchain and AI, and I think they're two we're seeing technologies working together more. We're seeing things like IoT devices, Internet of Things devices, working on blockchains, or AI bots actually triggering and saying, well, that's the oracle in. So take, for example, a ship has just arrived, and therefore the IoT device knows the ship's arrived, and it actually then tells the AI engine to trigger a payment to pay for the customs, pay for the shipping costs, pay for the harbour duties. As opposed to what happened before, is that the ships will be hanging around outside a port waiting for the money to arrive. Now, what we're seeing with blockchains, one of the best things about blockchain technology is that it enables a lot more transparency. Blockchain is no more than an Excel spreadsheet on steroids, as we've talked about before. But all it is really blocks of information sort of linked and chained together. So you can't change, information, say, several months ago, unless you unchain all the other ones before.
Yeah.
Therefore, if you've got good information, and AI needs, because poor information in means poor decisions out. If you've got good information, and this is particularly important in the carbon credit industry, because unfortunately there have been a few projects which have been less than successful because people were meant to be spending the money, investing the money on good things, but actually it turned out they didn't plant the trees.
Yeah.
Or,
there were trees that were never going to be cut down in the first place, or there was an opportunity to double count.
So going back to the pro-consumer, I've got a solar panel and you're my next door neighbour, and I then sell the energy to you at half the price you would get, but it means it accelerates the timeline for my solar panel, therefore encourages the man and the lady down the road to actually have a solar panel. So I say, well, I've paid for my thing within, say, 3 years. Oh, wow. And it's put it's generating income, which when you go to sell the house is a positive thing. But if we can't verify when that energy was being created, it makes it very difficult. But more importantly, if we can verify, then not only can I sell the energy to you, but perhaps I can sell the carbon credits to, Microsoft or British Airways or someone that actually needs to offset their carbon credits. So and people overlook that. And okay, these are all very, very small, but what this is I think a good example of the decentralisation of society. And what I mean by that is that a few years ago we saw the FANGs, the Facebook, Apple, Netflix, Google, etc., that had become mega successful because they were selling your data, your information. And now what we begin to see with tokenization and digitalization and the use of blockchain is that you're empowered to sell your healthcare data, your travel data, your spending data. And if you start producing things like your own renewable energy, you can sell your carbon credits, you can sell that energy. And so that opens up massive amount of micropayments for individuals. And that's something which you just cannot do with cash. It's so difficult to send someone, 2p if the transaction cost. Look, Swift is the most expensive email system in the world. It's $25 to say Barclays owes BNP, £10 million. It's still 20. It doesn't need to cost that sort of money. And actually the settlement times on cash, it can be 3 or 4 working days. So here we are just before Christmas. And if you actually make a payment on a Monday the 22nd, always appreciate it's a nightmare when you mention dates on podcasts. You might want to edit that out. But let's say you want to make a payment on a Thursday. Then typically that money will not be received at the correspondence bank until probably the following Monday or Tuesday. So you've got Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday. You've got 5 days. Why?
But can you see a situation where the big corporates move away from Swift to something more decentralized?
Massively. They're going to be forced to.
Okay.
So if you go back in time, I know you've been spending a bit of time in America. Well, in 1863, there were 8,000 different types of US dollars. 8,000. And probably the most famous one is a stagecoach company, now called Wells Fargo. So you had stagecoach companies, you had cities, you had shops, you had states, all producing their own version of a US dollar. Now you fast forward to now, and post the Genius Act that the Trump administration has introduced in 2025, you've already seen Klarna, Sony, Bank of America, you've seen Amazon talking about it, all talking about issuing their own US dollar because they're realising that it's, we did an article in Digital Bytes about 3 or 4 months ago and guesstimated that Walmart could make 1.3 billion more profit if just 20% of their customers moved from debit cards, not credit, debit cards, to a Walmart coin. Now, if you then amplify that and say, well, okay, if Walmart were to pay, or any other company, it starts paying their suppliers, instead of paying them 30, 60, 90 days, if it were to pay them, because the IoT devices said, okay, the good or the service now being delivered, pay them within 24 hours, or pay them immediately. But I'm only going to do that if you give me a reduction in your price. So if you're not 3% off your price, I'll pay you delivery versus payment, DVP. Now that's what the city wants. That's what Wall Street wants. That's what Paris, Singapore, they're all looking. When you buy and sell a security, a share or bond, you've delivered, I want payment. So if you pop down to your local wine bar or coffee shop and say, oh, excuse me, can I have a, I don't know, can I have a flat white? And tell you what, I'll pay you in 10 days. I'll just say, get out. Well, when I started in the investment market, that's what you had. You had 10 days to pay for your stocks and shares. So bringing it back to sort of energy and bringing it back to payments, we've seen a lot of experimentation on tokenizing carbon credits, on tokenizing the production of energy, on tokenizing real estate, on tokenizing shares and funds, all that sort of stuff. And that's now created quite a big industry. But actually not a lot of action on money. How are you going to pay for it? And that's what we saw with the Genius Act, saying we do not want a central bank digital currency. We want business and the private sector to innovate and to come up with a better and faster way. Not ban cash, but give people a choice.
I mean, there's so much sort of needs to be worked out. I think regulation is kind of a difficult topic, especially sort of at the moment in the States. But I mean, there's very much the European way, which is to kind of over-regulate and, over-consumer protect versus the
and make it very centralised, make it, digital euro, make it government controlled.
Exactly, whereas the US sort of approach is very different. But I think there are definitely some good use cases for digital infrastructure in terms of looking at energy and decarbonisation. But what do you think? 20 years' time, are we going to look back and are we going to say that digital assets were help in the energy transition? Were they an accelerant, or were they somehow an additional obstacle and challenge? Did they somehow make it harder? What do you think?
The current infrastructure in the energy markets is not fit for purpose. We need to either invest literally hundreds and hundreds of billions in most countries. So it's the sort of sums which it's not going to happen. You're then going to have that the physical infrastructure of power lines straddled all over the country. And most environmentalists just will not let that happen. So there has to be an alternative. And turning consumers into producers, the prosumer, if you like, has to be a part solution. It's not the entire solution. You're always going to need a base load. You're always going to need the production in the case that, say the wind doesn't blow or the sun doesn't shine or whatever it may well be. So we're going to have to continue to have some form of national infrastructure. But I think giving people a choice has to be a good thing. And I think we're going to look back. I'm personally more excited about the outlook for the economy over the next 5 to 10 years than I have in the last 30 years. Okay. Because I honestly think that the impact of AI on real world problems, on material science, on engineering, on medical, and on energy is going to have a huge impact. And that'll be a very, very deflationary impact. Because if we go from energy being, and utilities being quite expensive to almost free, that actually helps the lady and man in the street. Because you're actually got a lower cost of production. So I see not a wholesale shift and it's going to be all or nothing, but I do see the tokenization, digitalization of energy in particular. I think it's going to be a real positive for the economy in 10 years' time.
Okay, great. I love that positivity. And on that note, at the end of the first part, I always ask the guests about their predictions for the future. So I'm hoping we keep this positive outlook. So I guess my first question is always, what will the energy transition look like? How do you see that unfolding?
I think the energy transition will be individual countries and individual companies will become much, much less dependent and reliant on centralised command and control structures. So I think the idea of having nationalised energy systems and you effectively buying the energy off the government, I think that will become less and less. I think there'll always be a need for it.
Yeah.
And even at a government level, I think and we are already seeing this, you're seeing military establishments independent of the grid. So they've got their own power production facilities and backups and supports. And as we become more and more reliant on a digital infrastructure and electronic society we live in, you've got legislation like DORA in Europe, whereby it's not your Auntie Dora coming for Christmas, but it's being more resilient.
Yes.
What would you do if your power cable got chopped by someone digging up the water main?
Yeah.
Well, it doesn't happen. It might do.
Yeah.
So how are you going to cope with that? And therefore, companies are going to have to build that in, because otherwise they could get fined 4% a day of their annual turnover. So they've got to have sensible backup contingency plans, which we've had in the financial services sector for a while, but it hasn't gone across other sectors, and I think that's going to happen. So I think companies are going to have to be a little bit more mindful and responsible. And we're seeing this, particularly again, it's been led very much in America, whereby we're seeing the likes of Google, Apple, Amazon, they're all actually investing directly into power stations.
Yeah.
And recommissioning power stations.
Old kind of nuclear, especially up in like Pennsylvania, and they're buying the sort of power direct.
Absolutely. And then locating their data centres next to these eyesores, if you like. But there's no one in the data centres, they're just black box buildings. Yeah. They don't care the fact they've got a big chimney next door.
But there was a giant sort of nuclear power station there already, so it kind of makes sense.
Makes a lot of sense. Makes a lot of sense. So I think that's why I'm quite positive about this, because I think we can have a more grown-up, less command and control conversation, and there isn't one solution. We now have some alternative solutions, which increasingly are going to be rolled out over the next few years.
Well, that was I like the optimism, and I genuinely would. I'm just really looking forward to seeing how this really does unfold. As I agree with you. Digitization it's a really positive thing, and I think it's going to bring some very unexpected innovations going forward. And I think I know the answer to this, but I have to ask, will we get to net zero? Will we do it?
No.
No?
No. We won't get to net zero.
No.
No. We're not going to get to net zero. And without being too controversial, SJ, there's a huge debate whether we actually need to get to net zero. Just from a physical point of view, in terms of the way the globe operates and works, it doesn't spin centrally, it tilts from time to time. So we've had ice ages. We've had global warming to an extent. I think the bigger problem is not so much net zero, in my opinion. It's the waste. It's the waste. And I think that's something which we really, really, all of us can do something about. Unfortunately, when it comes to net zero, some of the biggest pollutants, some of the biggest reasons for where we are actually come to, homes burning bits of wood to light their fire. You're going to turn around and say, sorry, you can't have, wood-powered cooking? Well, of course you can't. Now, it doesn't help some of the things we're doing, but I think there's been a lot of political spin. Great way to generate taxes.
I mean, net zero also is a bit of an accounting thing rather than an actual kind of emissions thing. So we were, without going far too much back into carbon credits again, there is this kind of argument that, companies can continue to emit, but then can just pay their way out of it and have an accounting zero. And they're at net zero, which actually isn't where we want to be. We want to decarbonise the economy.
But it's just well, look, you travel over the world a lot more than I do. Where do you see it going? Where are you optimistic or are you worried?
I am optimistic. I don't think it will happen in the way in which we envisage it. I think there'll be, AI has really blown up over the last 3 years, and that has put a spanner in the works in terms of load growth and, various other kind of strain on our natural resources.
Well, because more energy is being required.
Yeah, and I don't think that was ever put in the models.
No.
But I think we'll adapt. I think we have to believe in humanity and believe in technology and believe in innovation. And I'm hopeful that enough people care about this and enough people are in the right place to set a regulatory environment that forces companies to comply. And I spend a lot of time with young people. I recently did my master's degree over in the US, and yeah,
is it all finished? Did you?
It is. I graduated.
Oh, congratulations!
Thank you. But I spent a lot of time with the undergraduate students there, but also with my classmates who were also master's students, and the young generation. They just have such a different outlook, and I think they really care. And I think if enough people really care, I think we will get there. And we are really starting to see the negative impacts of, whether you want to call it global warming, climate change, whatever, there's more extreme weather events and greater toll on humanity and on the economy. And I think we will get there. I just think it's maybe not going to turn out in the way in which we think it will. But I've got to believe. I work in energy. I am passionate about the energy transition and decarbonisation. So what am I doing here if I don't believe that? So that's my hope for the future.
Any particular country you're seeing, rather than just chat, actually, are you seeing, I know you travel to Australia and then you're off to Singapore, so are you seeing one particular region is leading the way, or are you seeing quite a good disbursement of it?
I wouldn't say there's one that's like leading the way. I think different countries have different things. It's very nice to see when I travel back to countries, they've maybe like cleaned up a public transport system that was sort of diesel or something, and it's now kind of more electrified. So there's like small things happening, and there's Australia obviously has the benefit of very warm weather and solar and things like that. Texas, although it has this huge reputation for traditional oil and gas, actually, as you say, is leading the way in renewables. China is doing really well with renewables. I think there's lots of different things, and it's a real pleasure to go back to different places and see those changes. I spent a lot of time in the Alps. I'm a skier. I was a ski guide before I was an attorney.
Oh,
and I see the physical effects of climate change on the glaciers. So I have to be positive that this is something that we are going to collectively work on.
Well, I think it's just on Texas. It's quite an interesting fact. They're just setting up a digital exchange in Texas. So NASDAQ are moving. So their secondary office is going to be in Texas, and they're setting up a digital exchange because NASDAQ have been lobbying, as have the DTC in America, lobbying SEC to recognise digital assets. They're really talking about private equity, private credit, and quoted stocks and bonds. However, you need these digital platforms, these digital exchanges, for digital trading of energy and carbon certificates. And here in London, the London Stock Exchange early this year announced the digital market infrastructure, which again is designed to actually trade private equity and private credit, both of which have been huge investors in energy. So these bits are beginning to come together, and the infrastructure, and back when we first met, there was no real infrastructure, and now it's only 5-6 years later we're seeing that coming through quite markedly, and that's what we write about every week in Digital Bites. We're looking at who, how, where, and why people are using blockchain and digital assets. Not so much crypto, but some of the conversations that we're having, which make it. That's why I'm so excited. We've actually got the infrastructure which we can now build on.
Absolutely, and I'll put a link to Digital Bites in the show notes so everyone knows where to find you. It is such an excellent resource. Ordinarily on the show, I like to ask people a little bit about what powers them outside of their work, but we have obviously had such an entertaining conversation, as is always the case.
Maybe another time.
You and we always end up having such interesting conversations, so I'm thrilled, and thank you so much for coming on my show.
Thank you for asking.
For educating the listeners, and for those that are watching the video, the viewers, on the energy transition and digital assets. And I'd love to have you back further down the line, and we can revisit some of these conversations.
I'll be delighted to. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, no worries. And Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas. And congrats on your Masters.
Oh, thank you so much. Cheers. That has been the Mind the Energy Gap, and we are live here from London. And thank you so much for following us along. Like and subscribe. See you soon. Cheers.